Carry on.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming. Today is Saturday, December 9th, here in sunny Houston. If anyone isn't thinking that the world is changing, Houston got some snow this week. How do you like that? There you go. 4 flakes, and everyone freaked out. But there's a lot of other changes going on in the world. And I want to say that our movement is very close now to the reprinting of this dossier on Robert Mueller, which really nails the role of the British sponsors, subversion and corruption of the whole process. It's something I developed in a class a couple of months ago, which people can access on YouTube. I'm going to be speaking today about something very special because our movement, the Schiller Institute, just completed a spectacular conference in a suburb of Frankfurt, Germany, which is called Securing Mankind's Future, the dream of mankind. On the occasion of that event, we released a special addendum to our reports that we've been putting out on the Eurasian Land Bridge and the New Silk Road as the organizing principle for all mankind. You can see the coverage of it, the cover of it, front and back up on the screen here. Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, a vision of an economic renaissance. And this was co-authored by Hussein Askari and Jason Ross. And it is an extension of a number of reports that we have put out over the last 25 years and thereabouts, which have changed the whole economic focus of the world around something called the New Silk Road and the Eurasian Land Bridge. And I'm going to develop what that is. But I'll show you this report here was the original called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, has become the organizing document by which the nation of China has become the engine of world development, not just in China, but extending into many other parts of the world. And we just got the news this week that our own mayor, Sylvester Turner, came back from China with a whole delegation. And we still don't have all the details. We do know that there's talk about setting up some sort of partnership around the airport, and I don't like to call it Bush Airport, it doesn't deserve that name, but the international airport as a direct link to China investment and development in this region, which really needs a lot of work, particularly in the wake of Hurricane Harvey and the aftermath of that. I'll also show you that this report also delivers circulation in Chinese and in Arabic. In fact, one of the co-authors of this report, Hussein Askari, was also this gentleman that graciously translated this report into Arabic, and it's been broadly circulated and studied in Yemen and many other Arabic nations, which are trying to seek a different path toward their own future. And so this is a very delightful report, which I've only read the synopsis, but it's a whole new direction of possibilities, particularly for Southwest Asia and Africa. And so first question, when he says extending the New Silk Road into West Asia and Africa, the question is, well, this is the New Silk Road, what was the old Silk Road? The old Silk Road was, as you can see from this pictures of the camels traversing the sandy desert, this was the link of commerce between Orient and Europe that brought, during the Roman Empire, during the Byzantine Empire, during what we call the Middle Ages, silk, porcelain, spices, and culture and ideas from the Orient and back again. So it was the case that there was this continual commerce of ideas and so forth, which was shut down effectively. I think it was in 1453 when the city of Constantinople, now we call it Istanbul, fell to the Seljuk Turks. And that, you know, the geography of Istanbul, it's right there where the Black Sea going to the Mediterranean, and effectively that was cut off. And this was one of the key motivating factors of Christopher Columbus trying to find another route to the Orient. And so in a way, the discovery of America is the result of the original search for the maritime Silk Road. And that's how these things happen. You strike out, and sometimes you find something that you didn't think you were going to find, and you're on the path of discovery, and you discovered something called America. So, but anyway, subsequent to Columbus' discovery, you did have waves of explorers and immigrants coming from Europe and Asia to America to try to establish something better, try to get away from the dismal world of religious wars and conflicts where people were governed not by nations but by families and bloodlines with no sense of the divinity and power of the individual. And that ugly paradigm is still with us today. It's been given a fancy name. It's called geopolitics. Politics of divide and conquer, of controlling people on bestial aspects of religion to pit people against each other. And some people think that's the only way it can be. And people of my generation were called the baby boomers. We were told that effectively, well, we are a beast, and the beast is pitted against each other. But anyway, what had happened in the last 30 years is that old division of the world, the division of the world that we remember as kids, the East and West, the free West against the communist East, that went down with the fall of the wall. And one of these days, we'll go through once again the unique role of Lyndon LaRouche in our movement, bringing about the end of that artificial division, because LaRouche was very, very central to that process. But what it did mean that geographically, that the old trade routes from east to west could be opened up again, and they were. And today there's, I'll take the next slide, Mike. There's a whole array of railroads and trade routes between east and west. I think 36, 40, maybe 50 new railroads have opened up between the Orient and Asia. And this has brought the possibility of development to the interior, and it's good. It's all to the good, because in a world where you see religious conflict and so forth dominating headlines, if you have people working on a common mission for mutual development, mutual prosperity, they discover certain divine qualities in themselves which are genuine, are real, reflect that godlike power, that godlike spark of creativity that we're all given, and people can get along with each other. And one piece of news that we had this week, which initially sounds disturbing, you have to think about it, but President Trump put out the word that we're going to relocate the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which actually was passed as an act of Congress back during the Bill Clinton period, but it's been postponed because the implications of it are, well, Israel sees Jerusalem as its capital, but then so do the Palestinians, which occupied that land for hundreds and hundreds of years. After this, is this a paradox that we can overcome. Well, our movement years ago issued something called the Oasis Plan for that whole region, because look at the Dead Sea, look at the area around Suez Canal, if you look at the mineral potential there, look at the skilled workforce among Palestinians, you have a peaceful development strategy of developing the whole region for, the abundance, the possibilities of water and other kinds of development. And of course, Palestinians and Israelis can coexist peacefully. But the empire paradigm says no, we're all just a bunch of people who profiled and pitted against each other based on race, religion, territory, scarce resources, and greed. And so these are the two paradigms that are at work. And when Helga, Mrs. LaRouche, says we have to create a new paradigm, that's what we have to do. We have to change the culture first and create a future-oriented culture. Now, let's take the next image, because I'm going to show you another map of the world. This is the world at night. This is a satellite view of flying over the world at night. I think you can see this bright dot there. I guess that's the city of Houston, and you can see Europe. You can see Rio de Janeiro. You can see the bright lights around Tokyo and China. But can you see Africa? This is outrageous. Because after all these years, most of Africa does not have access to electricity. It is a dark continent, a continent that's kept in deliberate underdevelopment and backwardness through a policy which now has an opportunity to be overturned. And if you remember that picture of the smiling ladies at the beginning in front of that train on the cover, those are two very happy ladies that are employees of the beautiful new railroad that the Chinese helped construct in Kenya, that they're taking from the port of Mombasa to the capital of Nairobi, which has all sorts of positive implications that I'll talk about. I have another picture right here, Mike, on the cover of the current EIR of this railroad. Yeah, Mike. Yeah. This is it. Now, what you have here is another image on the screen here of what people have seen of Africa recently. You've seen this during the Obama period, but going back to Bush, beginning of the regime change wars, Iraq, Libya, but also economic devastation. It's all these images of millions and millions of people risking their lives and sometimes dying, to get the heck, out of Africa and the Middle East, anywhere. Votes being overturned. Sometimes you saw the people pushed back or herded into camps and so forth, right? Is this a natural phenomenon? It's absolutely not a natural phenomenon, but it does indicate an absolute failure of what has been U.S. policy and where did it come from. And I say this because people know that the biggest problem in Africa today is the residual legacy of colonialism and post-colonial, neo-colonialism. And it would seem obvious that we, as citizens of a republic called the United States, that was founded in a revolution against colonialism, against the First Empire, that we would have a certain kind of kinship with people trying to escape that anywhere in the world. And frankly, most of your fellow people simply don't care. And a lot of people think, well, this is natural, or maybe this is because of overpopulation. And I'm going to develop a little bit how this kind of thinking came about. So before I go into the beautiful aspects of this wonderful part that Jason and I put together, I want to go through a little bit of American history in terms of our African policy. that there were potential points of great collaboration and progress these were subverted and overturned. So, for the first 100 years of our existence as a nation, and for many, many years before that, people know that most of our relations with Africa were centered around the very ugly fact of human slavery, where you had millions of black Africans, taken away. Sometimes you had tribal wars over there where the winning side would sell the losers, which were then shipped over here. Slavery mostly in the South, but not limited to the South. And this contaminated the thinking of some of our founding fathers. But there's one of our founding fathers who stood out as unique, absolutely opposed to all of this on the deepest principles. And that was Alexander Hamilton. Of all the founding fathers, he was the Treasury Secretary for George Washington. But he was one founding father who was not born in a Christian colony. He was born in a little Caribbean island called Nevis. He grew up in a tiny island. I don't know if it was a nation or what. He grew up in St. Croix, and at that time, 90% of the population was enslaved. And it was a sugar colony, so everything, but it was just basically one big sugar plantation. And they had to be kept, in subjugation through the most brutal, forceful methods. And Hamilton hated slavery. He not only saw it as evil and degrading, but he also saw it as economically stupid, regressive and stupid. And he found a way to get the heck out of St. Croix and up to New York City. He led, in addition to all his other contributions, he was the leader of the Manumission Society very early on. He did against the agrarian faction, pro-slavery faction, which included, regretfully, Thomas Jefferson. But he also, in his economic writing, on the 4 essays he wrote on manufacturing, on the establishment of the National Bank, he developed a school of economics which established emphatically the source of wealth, the creative power of the human mind, and its application of the creative transformations of nature through science, technology, and industry. No one can devise a machine that can do the work of 100 slaves, right? And really assert the dominion over nature as God would like us to do. And so that's the kind of concept of economics, which of course Lyndon LaRouche developed early on, understanding a creative spark that is the source of economic wealth. Not money, not raw materials, resources, but that creative endeavor. And he got into intense battles over this at the founding of our nation, but it's that spark that Hamilton gave us on this question, because that is what makes us American. What happened to Hamilton is that he was shot dead in a duel that was set up by effectively the leader of the other paradigm, Aaron Burr, right, who was a British Tory trader who happened to be vice president of the United States at the time. Thomas Jefferson was vice president. Burr was on his way to become governor of New York. He was going to lead a secession faction to split New York out of the Union. Later on, he led a secession movement to split the western areas out of the Union. But today he's still around because he is proudly displayed on the website of Chase Bank, because he is the founder of Chase Bank, commonly known as the Bank of Manhattan. So there you have two paradigms at work right in this picture, right? Questions of money, credit, and finance, are they there to enslave us, right? Or are they servant of this higher power of the individual? And so those are the two paradigms. Now, what happened is that Hamilton, by his own sacrifice, Burr's political career was effectively destroyed at that point by this incident. But our nation moved forward with a lot of internal problems because the British continued to assault us. We had the War of 1812. Everyone should read Bob Ingram's beautiful series in the Executive Intelligence Review on the early fights by the African American cadre and their allies, against the Southern slavocracy and their co-thinkers in Manhattan and Austin. We had President Monroe lead an operation whose intention was to take all the free blacks and send them back to Africa. I kid you not. This is what created a nation we now know as Liberia. The capital is Monrovia. Right? I had always thought it was a question of repatriating the slaves. No, they wanted to keep the slaves here. It was the free blacks they were trying to figure out a way to get rid of. So that is not a very wholesome image of that particular aspect of our history. But it wasn't until the Civil War and Lincoln's final victory over the South, which he knew he was fighting the British Empire, he worked in league with Russia to crush the Confederate conspiracy, but he also had a positive vision for Reconstruction, which may not have been realized fully because he himself was assassinated. But nonetheless, moving out of the Civil War, that question of the British conquering us was put to rest, and they went to other methods. But a lot of good stuff happened. We 2 years after the war, we completed the Transcontinental Railroad, which was the land bridge link across the United States. Right? Next. We acquired the nation, or the territory of Alaska from Russia, our wartime ally. And yes, if you recall that first map I showed you of the New Silk Road and the land bridge, which included the bridge across the Bering Strait from Alaska to Siberia. This was something that was actively discussed between Lincoln and Sir Alexander, who were both passionate railroad builders. It still hasn't been built yet today, but this week Helga LaRouche was on a beautiful bridge that links the mainland of China to Hong Kong. And that bridge is shorter than the one we would have to build to get from Alaska to Siberia. So let's do it, okay? But we were still occupied with internal problems. I'll show you one beautiful picture here. That in 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant, who was not a politician, but he took up, he took the presidency because no one else was adequate to the responsibilities at that time. He invited the whole world to Philadelphia to show, the greatness of the American system, the railroads, the infrastructure, technology, breakthrough. What you see in this picture here is President Grant and his wife Julia in conversation with the delegations from Egypt and Sudan in Philadelphia. And the sign there said something like, the oldest civilization in the world greets the newest civilization in the world. So there was an opening. There was a genuine openness to the idea that the success of the American system was absolutely a universal possibility. It was not a question of race or anything else. So this is what, and actually there was a team of economists that were sent around the world to propagate this against the empire. We had a guy named Shine Smith that went to Japan, Friedrich List to Germany. We'll have some classes on that some other time, but there was an openness there on Grant's part and co-thinkers that this was a possibility, that we should have this kind of human um, reaching out toward Africa. But Grant was very much tied down with problems of the South, including crushing the Ku Klux Klan that propagated through the South throughout the war. So while we were involved in these internal problems, other things happened. What you had here was the European powers scrambling to grab Africa, right? And this culminated in a conference that happened in Berlin in 1884 called the Berlin Conference. Basically, as the cartoon shows up on the upper left there, they basically sliced up the continent of Africa like a big cake or a big pie. And this little chart here goes through different countries: Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Germany. That's what, for the most part, drew the current borders of the nations that we now know as the African nations. Not in any sense of community or anything like that, but this geopolitical game for perpetuating the divide and conquer thing. The imperial powers in control. Little nations like Djibouti, which is just a little on the tip here. This little thing here. This functions to lock Ethiopia out of the water. Right, Gambia, which is just this little thing right here, where the river empties into the Atlantic Ocean. But see, the two names that you don't see on this list here is you don't see United States and you don't see Russia. These nations, we were not part of that land grab in Africa as the European powers were. Now, the guy on the right, that is Cecil Rhodes. Okay, Cecil Rhodes he was the head of De Beers Diamonds and a whole array of other cartels that, had this dominant British private force for depredation of Africa. And the cartoon shows him. People remember the Seven Wonders of the World? One of the Seven Wonders of the World was called the Colossus of Rhodes, which I think is a big statue of Hercules or Apollo or such Olympian god that used to be in the Roman period in front of the harbor of Rhodes. And it shows him with one foot on Cairo and the other foot on Cape Town and pretty much controlling everything in between. In fact, Mr. Rhodes got his own country. Yeah, it's called Rhodesia. That's the only country I've ever heard of that was named, except for Saudi Arabia, which was also named after the Saud family. Yeah, he had his own country, which was just seen as a private firm. It was and Rhodesia did not get its independence until 1980. It's amazing to think about, and it's just to the we know just last month the original president of Rhodesia, of Zimbabwe, what is known after its independence, Robert Mugabe, was overthrown. A new government has been brought in. We wish them the very best already. South Africa has extended a hand of support, and China has issued a big development loan for certain kinds of construction to get underway. But the British oligarchy they never forgive. They've always hated, the Mugabe and all the independence fighters that stood up to snatch the empire out from their control. The next. So there were a number of presidents who had a disposition, a Republican, to take America once again as a positive direction. One of them was Garfield, and one of them was McKinley. Not so much toward Africa, although that might have developed if they'd taken longer. Garfield was very, very open to his Secretary of State Blaine for opening things up towards South America. And he had a very, very decent civil rights record for African American population in the U.S. He was shot dead, and likewise McKinley, who had the misfortune of being propelled by public opinion into a war with Spain that he didn't want. And Vice President Teddy Roosevelt became president, of course, upon McKinley's death at the Pan-American Exposition. And Roosevelt was already in touch with a British lord named Cecil Rice, who was coaching him, for example, around the Boer Wars in South Africa. It was natural that the British would control South Africa and not the Afrikaners, who were Dutch. And but coming out of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. did actually, for the first time in our history, obtain some foreign possessions, including Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, right? And this caused a great deal of excitement among British Empire elites. We can bring America into the imperial game. And next slide. And one of their key poets and propagandists wrote us a letter called "The White Man's Burden." It's a poem which I excerpted the first phrase here. "The White Man's Burden," and it was called an essay to the United States. "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the destitute breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' needs. Wait in a heavy harness on cluttered folk and wild, your new cult taught sullen people, half devil and half child." And that is the way the British oligarchy looked at the subject that they had under their control, and they were saying that the U.S. should now be part of this process. And what happened is that the empire, which really did not like the emergence of all these industrial nations, albeit imperfect, but remember that picture of the Philadelphia Exposition. You saw Germany emerge as a great railroad building power. You saw Russia emerge as an industrial nation with the Trans-Siberian Railroad, France and others, all emulating the United States. And the British launched the biggest geopolitical gambit of all, which was Germany against Russia. This was World War I, and it was also World War II. And at the point that Hitler, who had great support early on from the British oligarchy, including the king himself, King Edward, at the point that he struck a separate deal with Stalin and began to move west, that's when the British said, whoops, maybe we should do something different. Maybe we need the help of the United States to get our chestnuts out of the fire. Now, during the same period, you've got to remember that until the 1930s, the British Empire ruled the world officially. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The British Empire controlled about a fourth of the world's territory. It's not a secret. But Roosevelt had used the 1930s, President Roosevelt, to build up our nation through the Tennessee Valley Authority, which Marcia gave a class on a few weeks ago, the rural electrification, an array of infrastructure projects, once again on the Hamiltonian principle, of trying the creative powers of the individual, have self-respect and creative input. My dad worked in something called the Civilian Conservation Corps during that period. It was during this period, this was a miracle in the eyes of the world that was, for the most part, going in the other direction during that period. And so Churchill had needs to help and came over to Roosevelt. And that's at this point where a new possibility was created. Obviously, the American people were very, very reluctant to go to war. They felt burned by the process of World War I. But there was a secretive meeting that happened up in Newfoundland in August of 1941. And I'm going to point here, Mike, to this is a book which everyone should read and read and read again. That was a priceless testament by the son of Franklin Roosevelt, Elliott Roosevelt, who was, the title of the book is called As He Saw It. It's still available on Amazon and you can purchase it. But after his father had died, after things turned sour after World War II, Elliott left us the eyewitness testimony of what went on, at these summits, where Elliott was invited by his father just to have someone to shoot the breeze with after the intense negotiations. Plus, Elliott was a physical aid to his father who had polio. And so what I want to read here is early on is that we had this situation where Churchill desperately needed U.S. assistance, military assistance. So they had this very, very secretive meeting up in Sea Harbor, Newfoundland. And here, I'm just going to read a little bit from Elliott. Churchill shifted in his armchair. The British Empire trade agreements, he began heavily. Father broke in. Yes, those Empire trade agreements are a case in point. It's because of them that the people of India and Africa, of all the colonial Near East and Far East, are still as backward as they are. Churchill's neck reddened and he crouched forward. Mr. President, England does not propose for a moment to lose its favored position among the British dominions. The trade that has made England great shall continue, and under conditions prescribed by England's ministers. You see, said Father slowly, it is along in here somewhere that there is likely to be some disagreement between you, Winston, and me. I am firmly of the belief that if we are to arrive at a stable peace, it must involve the development of backward countries, backward peoples. How can this be done? It can't be done, obviously, by 18th century methods. Now, who's talking about 18th century methods? Whichever of your ministers recommends a policy which takes wealth and raw materials out of the colonial country, but which returns nothing to the people of that country in consideration. 20th century methods involve bringing industry to these colonies. 20th century methods include increasing the wealth of a people by increasing their standard of living, by educating them, by bringing them sanitation, by making sure that they get a return for the raw wealth of their community. Around the room, all of us were leaning forward attentively. Hopkins was grinning. Commander Thompson, Churchill's aide, was looking glum and alarmed. The Prime Minister himself was beginning to look apoplectic. You mentioned India, he growled. Yes, said Father. I can't believe that we can fight a war against fascist slavery and at the same time not work to free people all over the world from a backward colonial policy. And there's more, and it's excellent, and everyone should read this book. And what happened is that coming out of that summit, you had the preliminary agreement for the U.S. arming of England to withstand Hitler's assault. But there was a document that was crafted which which Churchill signed, called the Atlantic Charter, that said that coming out of World War II, what are we fighting for? What are the principles we were fighting for? And Roosevelt stipulated that self-determination was going to be granted to every nation in the world coming out of World War II, every territory in the world. And as I've said, you know, in all likelihood, Churchill was crossing his fingers when he signed that document, but at that point he had no choice. And next picture, right? I will show you that my dear wife Betty and I had a opportunity a few years back to go up to Newfoundland, where my wife's family hails from, and this is the historic site right here, back Ship Harbor, and that little body of water in the back there. And this is not very well highlighted. To get to this place, you have to go down this rocky, gravelly road through the woods and so forth. But I saw the sign, we're going to go there, right? And so you can see it's a very crude relief. But even on that, you can see that Churchill is not very happy in this thing, right? And so it progressed from there. Next, Mike. So what happened is that there were other summits. Well, and going back to the India question again, there was a young man in Calcutta, India, toward the end of the war. He was 23 years old at the time. His name was Lyndon LaRouche, at enlisted, after doing some work actually in San Antonio and training. And so even though he had no inkling of what was going on in these private conversations with Churchill and Roosevelt, he saw in Calcutta, in the most evil, despicable way, you know, how the British would run on Hindu versus Muslim, other kind of insurgency, how they had created famines, you know, to murder millions of people, and justify it under the name of population reduction. And yet he also saw the love of these people and the hope. They came up with the LaRouche and said, will you give us, you know, technology after the war to develop it? Lyndon said he had no power, but he did involve himself a little bit in this very exciting liberation process that was going on. And we found out subsequently that even at that early age, LaRouche was put on the FBI watch list as someone to keep the eye on. So he got a very visceral sense of this early on. And so there were these other summits. We had the Casablanca summit. Actually, that first picture, Roosevelt and Churchill, I showed you, was from the Casablanca summit. I couldn't find a picture of FDR and King Mohammed of Morocco, but that's with King Farouk of Egypt on the upper left. That was the Tehran summit. That was Roosevelt meeting with the Shah of Iran. He was barely out of his teens at the time. On the bottom, that's Roosevelt meeting with Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. And it's covered in this book on it, that Roosevelt would use these occasions to just, and Churchill didn't like it, but Roosevelt would develop a rapport with these people and think, well, this is what we can do after the war. This is what we did in Tennessee. This is what we did with the dams. This is what Frank. So great possibilities of peaceful development coming out of the war. Now, at the Casablanca summit, you see where Morocco is on the map here, right here. They took a little detour on the way back to the U.S. and went down to this little nation called Gambia, a very small nation at the Alps, at the mouth of one of the rivers. And he got off the boat, and I guess they wheeled him around, and he got a chance to just take a look at life under the empire. And he came back, this was in 1943, and Roosevelt addressed a convention of what was called the Negro Newspaper Publishers Association. Okay? And in a certain way, Roosevelt was berating them because they weren't really, didn't cover in their domestic coverage, you know, the situation in Africa. Because, so I'm going to read this excerpt of what of FDR speaking to this group. And there is just one thing in there The only thing I didn't agree with, and that is a thing which your association, I think, could do something about. You talk about people in other countries, we all know that they are very different from Americans in every way. I will give you one example. Something has got to be done about it in time. Last year, I went to a place called Gambia in Africa at the mouth of the Gambia River. Bathurst is the capital. I think there are about 3 million inhabitants, of whom 150 are white. Think about those proportions there, right? And it's the most horrible thing I have ever seen in my life. I was there twice. The natives are 5,000 years back of us. Disease is rampant. Absolutely. It's a terrible place for disease. And I looked it up with a little study, and I got to the point of view that for every dollar that the British, who have been there for 200 years, have put into Gambia, they have taken out 10. It's just plain exploitation of these people. There is no education whatsoever. Now, the agriculture there is perfectly pitiful. The one main asset is peanuts. The natives grow a lot of peanuts. How do they grow them? They have been growing them now for years, and they still use a pointed stick. Nobody ever saw a plow in Gambia. The British have never done a thing about it. They only rode out of Bathurst, the capital, to go out to the airport. The rest of the travel is up the Gambia River, but not back into the country at all, only right by the river. I am taking up with Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the present time. I think you will see the point. The general thought that the United Nations ought to have an inspection committee of all these colonies that are way, way down the line, that are not ready to have anything to say yet, because the owning country has given them no facilities. And if we send a committee from the United Nations, and I use the example of Gambia, to go down to Gambia and say, if you Britishers don't come up to scratch, toe the mark, then we will let all the world know. Well, the Prime Minister doesn't like that idea. His comeback was, all right, the United Nations will send an inspection committee down to your own South in America. Then FDR said, well, he thought he had me. And I said, Winston, that's all right with me. Go ahead and do it. Tell the world. We call it freedom of the press. And you also call it pitiless publicity. You can right a lot of wrongs with piteous publicity. It would be a grand thing. I wouldn't mind if we had a committee of the United Nations come here and make a report on us. Why not? We have got some things to be ashamed of and other things that are not as bad as they are painted. It wouldn't hurt at all. Bring it out. So, says FDR to these newspaper publishers, so if your association could do something like that, which is a little bit more about the world, ... right? So, so you can see that Roosevelt had in mind that the miracle that we had created in Tennessee Valley, which he took a valley of, hillbillies and very backward people and transformed it to some extent to begin to overcome racism in the course of, full employment, of course, the war mobilization and so forth. You acknowledge they still have a long way to go, but peace through development, that was the philosophy. That's what Franklin Roosevelt wanted to bring to the world. So what did the British do? Well, they knew Roosevelt had polio, he had heart, and a host of other medical problems. They just ran him ragged with all these summits and other activity. They dragged out the war until he died. He died before the war ended. So Roosevelt won the war, but the British effectively won the peace because Churchill was able to capture Harry Truman. Beginning immediately with dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki unnecessarily. Say we're the toughest guys in town. Severing the positive association or conversation with Russia that Roosevelt had cultivated. And early on, Harry Truman was a moral pipsqueak compared to Roosevelt. Enunciated what was called the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine was effectively that the sole purpose, the sole mission of U.S. foreign policy is anti-communism, right? Anti-communism. So you're either with us, i.e. you're with Wall Street and West and custom finance, or you're with those bad communists, you know. And the CIA was going to work to overthrow or destabilize it. And even, you know, people like Nasser, Fidel Castro, and so forth that looked toward the east. Well, they were isolated, but moving ahead. But in response to all of this, you had come to existence in the mid-1950s something called the non-aligned movement. That said, we don't care about these power blocks. We just aspire for advancement and development and dignity, right? Our nation, you know. A lot of the leaders of the non-aligned movement are people that LaRouche was in conversation with at the time, Indira Gandhi and others. And so, but you still have the legacy of the Atlantic Charter, which these nations were given in Africa and all the subject nations, also in Asia, the right to self-determination as stipulated. That was one of the founding principles of the United Nations. And a very important breakthrough nation was formerly known as the Gold Coast, but came into existence as 1957 as the nation of Ghana. Okay, and among other people at that beautiful event establishing Ghana as a nation was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was at that founding ceremony, and he really talked about that. 1957, right? And the first president was a real intellectual named Kwame Nkrumah. Now, what was going on in the U.S. Congress at the time? Well, people know in 1957, well, maybe by that time, McCarthy stuff had begun to blow over, but you had the Korean War, you know, this whole communism versus the West thing. And this was sort of intense brainwashing, you know, in that period. You had to say the right thing. You couldn't be heard thinking any communist thoughts or something. You know, they were policing American culture. It's Christmas time. Everyone loves this movie. It's still one of my favorite movies. It's a Wonderful Life. Stewart, you know, that movie was actually said to be a proto-communist movie because it says bad things about bankers. You know, I mean, this is the kind of stupid stuff that went on. But there was one guy in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who was the head of the African subcommittee that stood up as an independent voice, Mike. And that was a young man. And this is from a speech that he gave on the floor of Congress on the question of Algeria. Okay. I think it's about that time. I think it's about 57. This was in 1959. He says, I don't think I can do Kennedy's accent very well. Maybe my Boston wife Betty can come up and do it, right? But anyway, so he says, but he's referring directly to Rudyard Kipling here, right? For today, years after the white man supposedly took up Kipling's predestined burden, most of the exploited natives live a life that holds no greater meaning for them than the unending search for food for themselves and their children. While non-African nations fattened and prospered materially from African natural resources, the tributes remain destitute. Per capita income amidst acres of diamonds, lush pastures, and now uranium itself is generally below $50 a year. But our purpose is not merely to criticize the past or deploy the present. We want to help the states of Negro Africa. We have already given some help. It was not enough. We are giving some help today. It is not enough. Our goal for the good of Africa, for the good of the West, is a strong Africa. A strong Africa can only result from a strong people. No people can become strong in a climate of servitude and social indignity. What can the United States do? It is in this area of economic development that a new American policy toward Africa must begin. Our leaders must talk of winning the battle for men's minds, which the vice president expressed upon his return from that continent. There may be importance attached to the prompt recognition of new states, improved diplomatic relations, and membership in international institutions. But the people of Africa are more interested in development than they are in doctrine. They are more interested in achieving a decent standard of living than in following the stand of either the East or the West. Let me stress, however, that economic progress in Africa is not the responsibility of this nation alone. It is primarily the responsibility of the Africans. It is also the responsibility of those European nations who have for centuries extracted the wealth of that continent. Perhaps the most effective way to provide financial help for investment, development, and personnel might be through multilateral cooperation with African, European, and American and other countries in an African regional economic plan. Such a program should properly be initiated by the African states and be sufficiently elastic to negotiate and coordinate bilateral and multilateral arrangements. African states will participate on the basis of complete equality as givers as well as receivers. But whatever final method is used, sound, orderly economic development for Africa should be on the priority agenda of the 86th Congress in Washington. If African progress falters because of lack of capital and education, if these new states and emerging peoples turn bitter in their taste of independence, then the reason will be that the Western powers, by indifference or lack of imagination, have failed to see that it is their own future is also at stake. So think about that, right? Speaking that, in 1959 on the floor of Congress, and of course it was the very next year that he ran for president, and he was the senator from Massachusetts, and he won. And of course, the vice president he was referring to in that speech was Richard Nixon, who had gone to Africa but was telling them that they shouldn't be communists, they had to be for the West, but Kennedy was saying, look, they need development, they need material advancement, they need infrastructure. And so the first head of state that President Kennedy invited to the White House was Kwame Nkrumah, the new president of Ghana. And I'm going to abbreviate because he had written a book called Africa Must Unite, which later on became a founding document of the Organization of African Unity. What you see here is Kennedy and then Kwame Nkrumah probably in a cab or in the backseat of a limo, right? And what you have there is a beautiful dam called the Volta Dam, which I'm going to talk to you about. And this is a very important contribution of America to the development of Ghana, but it was not something that JFK had to fight personally for. So this is from Nkrumah's 1961 book. Poverty is progressively reduced only as productivity increases, industrialization progresses, and part of its surplus can be made available to increase wages, better housing, and generally improve social conditions. All industries of any major economic significance require the basic facility, a large and reliable source of power. Newer nations like our own, which are determined to catch up, must have a plentiful supply of electricity if they are to achieve any large-scale industrial advance. This basically was the justification for the Volta River project. And this was also going to involve melting aluminum because Ghana and its neighboring country, Guinea, had substantial bauxite before all they'd been doing is mining it and shipping it out. So they were because it's a complex process turning bauxite into aluminum, but this is one of his dreams. The World Bank and the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, were not in favor of funding the project. But Nkrumah was able to get some initial support from President Eisenhower while he was still president. But then it was John F. Kennedy who personally pushed this through. And it was completed in December of 1965. This beautiful dam, which has created to this day the largest artificial lake in Africa and possibly the world, the Volta Lake behind us. But you also have here, this was from Doug DeGroot. After the dam was built, Lake Volta became and still is the largest artificial body of water in the world. Now that may have changed. This was written in 2012. After the turbines were refitted, the Akosombo hydroelectric power complex now produces 120 megawatts of power. Nkrumah inaugurated the hydroelectric complex January 22nd, 1966. A month later, February 24th, 1966, he was overthrown in a coup organized out of the city of London with support from the CIA. Yes.
Was it American financing and American engineers, who were involved?
There was definitely some American financing, and there was some American technological input, but I don't know. Evelyn says that possibly some Canadian. That's worth looking into more. Another thing is that let me read a little bit more here. Before he was inaugurated the Akosombo complex, Nkrumah was also already looking far beyond hydroelectric power to nuclear energy. He laid the foundation stone for the atomic research reactor in Ghana, November 25th, 1964. He said, "Our sole motive to build the center is to enable Ghana to take every advantage of the decisive methods of research and development which mark our modern world. It is essential to do this if we are to impart our development the acceleration that is required to break even with more advanced economies. We have therefore been compelled to enter the field of atomic energy, as this already promises to yield the greatest economic source of power since the beginning of man. Our success in this field would enable us to solve the many-sided problems which face us in all spheres of our development in Ghana and in Africa." And there's a lot more. This guy's a great, powerful intellectual, and he was on his way to China to try to put himself in the middle of a negotiation process to end the Vietnam War when he was overthrown while he was out of the country. This is not the only instance there were many instances of patriotic leaders who were deposed through British, U.S. intelligence collaboration. But, as we all know, Kennedy himself, who had been the champion of African development, was assassinated in 1963. And at that point, the culture of progress, which we at least had retained in the United States, began to be taken down. Mike? Here's Kennedy with the Dulles brothers. Were one of the footnotes of history that people may know is that Allen Dulles was sacked after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, but he ended up back up on the Warren Commission that basically whitewashed the larger conspiracy around the Kennedy assassination, just pinned it on the lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. But once again, think about Lyndon LaRouche watching this thing unfold and looking around and saying, got to do something. So next. Yeah, so the culture began to shift away from the culture of progress to a hatred, a suspicion, a dislike for progress. And of course, the Green Movement, people should remember, was kicked off through the offices of this man right here, Prince Philip. Prince Philip was the founder of the World Wildlife Fund, which they call the Worldwide Fund for Nature, which dopey commercials on TV lately about the elephants. That's the WWF. And if you want to, and as I said, Philip chaired the World Wildlife Fund for 35 years. He held that until 1996. Okay, and if you want to see what Philip really thinks of the wildlife, you can look at the next slide. There they are. See that poor little tiger there? Yeah, that poor little tiger. Anyway, and that's Philip, and that's Her Royal Highness, there, right? And so what did the WWF do in Africa? Well, they did a lot of things. If I can show this, Mike, this is a picture. If you can see all the darkened areas there, these are the private territories that the WWF would just buy up huge tracts of land in Africa. In fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, had over 8% of the land locked up in these private, safari hunting reserves of the WWF. But many of the times these reserves would be put on place where you would just geographically want to build a dam or an infrastructure project. They would say, no, you can't do this. But let me just read you a couple of quotes from Prince Philip here, right? Just to see his outlook. You can go back to the other one if you want, Mike. Go back one slide. He says, I don't claim to have any special interest in natural history, but as a boy, I was made aware of the animal fluctuations in the number of breed animals and the need to adjust to cull the size of the surplus population. The great difficulty about life is that we humans are part of it, and it is therefore almost impossible to study objectively. It therefore tends to be anthropocentric and gives scant attention to the welfare of the other life forms which share this planet with us, right? And he says, here's in an interview, what do you consider the leading threat to the environment? Human population growth is probably the single most serious long-term threat to survival, and so forth. So when he's talking about calling the herd, he's talking about calling the human herd, okay? But there was even a more insidious thing, which a lot of these territories that I showed you are in the frontier regions between nations. You had around Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and so forth, just a hideous genocide that happened with the Hutu tribe. This was in the mid to late 1980s, 1985 to 86, where you had pouring out of the Virunga. We found this out. That the Virunga Mountain Park, one of these reserves, had been the training ground for a violent outfit called the Rwanda Patriotic Front, which was Hutu, and with connivance of a fellow named Museveni, who was the head of Uganda at that time. Out of this park, you had the Hutus, going into tiny Rwanda, and we had over the course of about a couple of months, 800,000 people killed. 800,000 people killed. And of course, this is around Lake Victoria, as it's called there, which people believe is their own vacation paradise and so forth. And we compiled this in the this report called the Coming Fall of the House of Windsor, which is a killer document which makes it for people that don't think the oligarchy has any power in the world. They do, but particularly power in how they've corrupted Americans to come to accept this. Because how many people, when you see something like that, say, well, they're always killing each other over there, right? That's just Darwin, survival of the fittest, which is another British pseudoscience. The Darwinian track was actually originally conceived as a racial thing, So anyway, in this context, It was in this context of the degradation of the baby boomer culture to accept these new axioms in the 1960s that the LaRouche movement once again, entered the scene. And and I'm just going to show you, if you flip ahead, some of the stuff that we put out over the years. One little footnote here. The environmental argument is still used to justify all sorts of stuff. And of course, South Africa, when they saw Barack Obama ascend to the presidency, said, finally, we've got an African American in the White House. He's going to look out for our interests. Finally, we got a fair shake from the West that we didn't get with the Bushes and so forth, right? And they literally, as you can see, hold out the red carpet for him. That's Jacob Zuma, the president there, at his side. And President Obama, went to the University of South Africa, and he gave this little speech. And then he says, the biggest threat in the world, what's the biggest threat in the world, right? Poverty, war, disease. No, the biggest threat is climate change, right? He says, ultimately, Barack Obama talked to these young students at the university. Ultimately, if you think about all the youth that everybody has mentioned here in Africa, if everyone is raising living standards to the point where everybody has got a car, and everybody has got air conditioning, and everybody has got a big house, well, the planet will boil over unless we find new ways of producing energy. And then he goes into the about what we need is wind and solar. Well, you know what? Africa has had wind and solar energy for about, 10,000 years and longer, right? They need advanced energy. And another thing I didn't mention is that in terms of the land grab, one of the biggest land grabs of all is these European powers grabbing, millions of hectares of land to grow biofuels down there. It's not feeding anybody, it's just being dumped into the gas tanks of Europe. But this is a crime, that's being justified under the name of, a green premise. Now, of course, my good friend Alfred here is never the Green Party, right? But green means things in my book like irrigation, like improving the environment. Think of the forest fires in California right now. Is that good for the environment just to let the forest burn down? No. They've got to get some water in there. That means building the infrastructure. That means cultivating, not natural. Absolutely. So anyway, forward, Mike. So anyway, the LaRouche movement entered the scene. And of course, we didn't know everything from the get-go, but LaRouche started from a hypothesis, of this idea of, first of all, he did have a visceral sense of the British Empire. It took us a while to try to figure out our own history as Americans, because it was so contaminated by, British thinking, right? There was a question of Marx and working through all of that stuff. But nonetheless, we came up against, one of the individuals we came up against was Henry Kissinger, right? Who's now Sir Henry Kissinger, by the way. And yes, and in 1975, Henry Kissinger actually forced through a national security memorandum, National Security Study Memorandum 200, which stipulated that the big threat, the national security threat of the future is overpopulation, right? And specifically because the raw materials of certain areas of the world, which we control, might be threatened by the demands of a population that would likely use them for their own benefit. And I'm reading here, National Security Study Memorandum similarly concluded that the United States was threatened by population growth in the former colonial sector. It paid special attention to 13 key countries in which the United States had a special and political strategic interest. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Turkey, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. So U.S. policy at that point was, yes, to encourage, and they did attach aid requests to towing the line on contraception and things like that. But who was the head of the CIA under Jerry Ford? Anybody remember? The guy we call Rubbers Bush. That's right. Right. And so when you see these things unfolding, like I just told you about Rwanda, Burundi, and so forth, this is policy. There was something that happened in 1980 called the Lagos Declaration, where the nations of Africa. This was right after finally Rhodesia had become Zimbabwe. They met in Lagos. They met. They also met in Ethiopia, and they came out with a very good document on the need for infrastructure and industry and of Africa, right? But then they naively said, well, we should just go to the United Nations and make this the core of the new development decade. Let's make the 1980s the decade of Africa, right? And Mr. LaRouche wrote an addendum, which we published, and he says, look, this is great, but don't be naive. You have to understand that there's an intention here. You have to address that intention in what's unfolding in Africa. And so our movement intervened in many different ways, producing one document after another, on how to bring this about. This was the 1988 conference of the Schiller Institute. Next. This was Fusion Magazine, 1979, right? We had this magazine, which led the fight for nuclear power and scientific advance in this country, and its height, it had 250,000 readers and subscribers in the United States. I know because I was the circulation manager of that publication for a while. And so, in the wake of Jimmy, 250,000, and it went into all the libraries and scientific institutions, and so we were finding that this was America's genuine national interest, right? Participating in the development of the world, right? Helga LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche took leadership. Look back right here. Founded an agency, a new institution called the Club of Light, the direct counterpole to the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome was a think tank of the European oligarchs pushing population control and population reduction. Development is the name for peace. So we were always trying to appeal to the better part of the American heritage that, this is what we ought to be doing as a nation. Move on to the next one. But, once again, I come back to this picture of one of the refugee camps. Obviously, the Lagos Plan of Action, all these, well-meaning plan of actions didn't bear the kind of fruit that was required. And certainly since the September 11th attacks, which followed from the fall of the Berlin Wall, the wall heaved a sigh of relief and said, okay, that old split between East and West is over. Now we can concentrate on the higher green visions of mankind, to stop poverty and so forth. No, first of all, LaRouche was in prison. LaRouche was put in prison in December of '89, and the neocons who were in the driver's seat at this point, you had somewhat of a hiatus under Bill Clinton, but nonetheless, their policy was, no, we're going to have the U.S. Everywhere. Right? We had this thing just a few months ago with this soldier who was killed in Niger, and this crazy thing where Trump calls up the mom, and he didn't say exactly the right thing, and the congresswoman of Florida puts on her cowboy hat, and Trump's a racist, and back and forth. But people should have asking is, what the heck are our troops doing in Niger? What are we doing down there? Did we have any troops in Niger? Well, the U.S. has troops in 135 countries around the world right now. This has been basically the front end of U.S. foreign policy, that the front end of it is our military presence, which is usually justified under the name of, fighting terrorism, as it was in Nigeria, to fight Boko Haram. But it's not the Army Corps of Engineers. And in fact, right here in Greater Houston, there's still push underway to take the Ellington Field down there on Old Galveston Road and turn it into the U.S. base for what's called U.S. AFRICOM. U.S. AFRICOM is going to be the U.S. military command for Africa. It was set up by Donald Rumsfeld, and I guarantee you Donald Rumsfeld is not some charitable do-gooder, who wants to send the troops in to, give them the benefits of Western progress. So this idea, that's part of the old paradigm that we have to overturn. And it is being overturned, but it's not on the initiative of the United States. Next. So with the ongoing failure of the Western free market model, with the openings that were created by the fall of communism and a series of extraordinary leaders coming to power around the world, a new institution to enable the development to occur. This is one of the meetings that happened in Fortaleza, Brazil, what's called the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Don't see America in there anywhere, or Britain. The lady that hosted that event has now been impeached, Dilma Rousseff, although her successor may be back in the driver's seat, Lula, pretty soon. But this is very important that new institutions and credit for world development are coming into this next. But, where do we fit in? Well, first of all, Mrs. LaRouche, Helga LaRouche, has played an extraordinary role while her husband, Lyndon, was in federal prison, that very formative period between 1989 and 1994. In the fall, we not only had the fall of the Berlin Wall in late 1989, but in May of 1989, you had Tiananmen Square in China, which was an existential moment for China, where the model that they had come to accept from Nixon and Kissinger of sweatshop labor, the equivalent of maquiladoras producing cheap consumer products and investing in the Western markets, blew up in their face. And we now know subsequently that the mobs, that you saw in Tiananmen Square were being, funded and promoted and pushed forward by George Soros and Gene Sharp, right, with the intention of just an absolute fragmentation. And so, yes, the tanks at a certain point did roll in, but at that point, China, who had been looking at our stuff, I know personally that they were coming to all of our seminars back in the 70s and 80s, in Washington, D.C. They went with a radical reorientation, first of all, toward developing their own population, and it's an extraordinary thing. They've lifted, in the last decade and a half, 800 million people out of poverty. There's no other, record like that in the world. But also, the reaching out toward the transport routes toward Europe. That's a picture of Helga at Lianyungan, which is probably the eastern terminus of the Eurasian land bridge, is where one of these rail links goes as at the Sea of China. Next. And then in 2013 in Kazakhstan, President Xi Jinping announced officially that the Belt and Road was going to become China policy, and not just into China. And we're coming into the present period, right? So now I'm up to the point of what Hussein Asghari presented at our wonderful conference over there in Frankfurt. And these are recommendations. Obviously every nation's destiny, has to be decided internally. And there is an error. Those of you that were at our event in Texas Southern University that Brian Lance organized last year, you had these students, asking the child, well, what's in it for you? What's in it for you? There's got to be a catch. Why are you bringing this technology in, right? So this is subject to discussion. But anyway, so we had put forward these recommendations that in addition to new continental financing mechanisms, each nation should have something akin to a Hamiltonian national bank. where you can generate internal credit to make some of these projects move forward and not be subject to the whims of the International Monetary Fund and such agencies. Integrating transport networks with state-of-the-art high-speed rail systems, creation of navigation networks across rivers and lakes, hydropower, nuclear, and yeah, looks like some of the words are cut off. But in other words, you don't want to just concentrate on raw materials extraction. They need to have the process industries there to become real sovereign economies. Next. So I'm moving forward. These are excerpted from Kane's presentation. A beautiful new rail exists in Ethiopia from Djibouti to Addis Ababa, the capital. It used to take 3 days in their old transport system to get a product from the port of Djibouti to the capital. Now it takes 10 hours. And I want to say one thing about these railroads. There were railroads built during the colonial period. They were specifically crafted of different gauges. They were specifically crafted to take, to go to the copper mines, the diamond mines, the gold, suck out the loot and bring it back to the port. But because they were different gauges, the gauge is the width of the railroad track, you couldn't hook them up with each other for internal transport and development, right? And what China's been doing in some instances is going and tearing up the old tracks and making everything standard gauge. So the long-term vision is an internal commerce that they never really had before, right?
How many miles ago was that, Okay.
I would say maybe 600 miles. And so what, and we had, and people can look at the proceeds of our conference online. We had a really tight, growing, rich relationship with Ethiopia. Ethiopia, I believe, is the only nation in Africa which never actually was put under foreign occupation. Well, actually, I would have to say Mussolini. Mussolini took it over. That's true, but they were never made a colony. Anyway, so they've got a kind of a proud history. And what this is a picture is, some of these have been built, some not, but each of these dots are industrial parks, right? That are being, in the process of being built, right? With a lot of Chinese input, but China, there's these. Like there was a big summit conference in December of 2015 of what's called FOCAC, the Forum on Chinese-African Cooperation, and it went on for several months. So they're working this stuff out. It's not just China going in there and barking at them, and there is nation-to-nation discussion of what each individual nation's priorities are and so forth. Next. Well, it could be. They're probably named after cities that are already there. Hawassa, Adama, Pinto, Bore, Abreu, Berhan, but they're integrated industrial parks that enable as a magnet for training and so forth and so on. As I said, to develop the process industry, go beyond. And some of them are electronics and those, and other skills. Next. This is a beautiful railroad that has now recently been opened in Kenya, from the port of Mombasa to the capital, Nairobi. And as you can see there, I don't know if this is real or projected, but there's going to be a link then taking it up northward into Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has had historic food problems, and the problem has been that it took so long to get the food out. This is a general problem in Africa. A lot of the food they grow just rots. Not support before it spoils. Right. And so this was a great cause for celebration, the opening of this the railroad, and yes, it was. Next, Mike. This is something I don't think is completed. The Angola, Tanzania, Angola, and Tazara railways, the Transcontinental Railroad project, you know, in southern Africa. So it's the first transoceanic rail link. On the left, it says on the west side, Lobita Port. On the right, it might be Dar es Salaam. Next. Okay, now the Suez Canal project. This has been completed, and you know, people remember 10 years ago, Egypt was just being torn up through a Muslim Brotherhood. Just, you know, I mean, going back a little further, you had Mubarak, who was deposed because he had just accepted all the prescriptions of the Western financial interests, you know, as part of the package that came in with Camp David and Jimmy Carter, and they just had economic stagnation. Louise, who's here, could testify to that. She went to Cairo at least once or twice, right? But then you had Mohammed Morsi brought in, representing the Muslim Brotherhood, and he was going to be taking Egypt into become a partner with, you know, Obama's plan and the British plan to overthrow Assad in Syria, and the Egyptian people would have none of it. And you had millions and millions of people out on the street. And finally, Morsi was thrown out, and the military leader El Sisi is now the president. But immediately he said, "I got to do something about poverty and unemployment." And the new thing marked upon was to double the size of the Suez Canal. They said, "We're going to embark on this big project. Open your pocketbooks. Okay, we're going to finance this internally. We're going to put up government bonds." They raised the money to build that canal, I think, in 3 weeks. You know, and they did it. And now you've got a doubling of commerce through the canal. And there's, you know, so the plans are to now try to find means of development to move some of the population away from the Nile River Valley into a lot of the other areas that have never been developed. I guess this is the high-speed railroad around Morocco. And of course, this is very interesting here because this is the link that we go from Morocco to Gibraltar. You know, I don't think it's been built. I don't think there's any serious, you know, Gibraltar link, just as a proposal, but I don't think it's actually moving because Gibraltar actually is a British protectorate. Anyway, this is moving forward next. Transaqua. This is a project that we have been at the LaRouche movement, the Central, promoting since the 1990s. It was actually by an Italian engineering firm, I think it's called Bonifica, and one of the representatives spoke at our conference in Frankfurt. But this lake here, Lake Chad, is a lake that actually has no outlet. So you have a number of rivers that kind of converge on this basin, and then it simply dissipates through evaporation. Some of it ends up in marshes. And then you have several different nations bordering Lake Chad that are using this for all, you know, for all sorts of things. You know, their own water supply. Anyway, it's been shrinking. It's lost about 75% in size, and so the Transaqua project is effectively building an artificial river, taking about 5% of the runoff water from Congo and Niger and other rivers and taking it northward. Otherwise, you know, no one will miss that water. It would just dump into the ocean. But this would, you know, create the conditions for turning that area around the lake into a fertile crescent type of thing, you know, for population and so forth. So, so now you have a Chinese consortium and the Bonifica company of Italy working together. You know, so far it's a feasibility study, but the company that's looking at this, and also the next project I'm going to show you is the same company that built the Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest dam in the world. Next. this is a projection of how just this one project could enrich the whole region. Next. The Grand Inga Dam. As I can see it, the Grand Inga Dam is actually 7 dams that I think from the Congo, isn't it? No, it's from the Congo. Some of it's been built, a lot of it's been postponed. The World Bank was supposed to put in a chunk of money for this, but they just canceled that money. They said, oh, your financing is not transparent enough. There might be corruption or something. So once again, it's but this would actually surpass, when all 7 dams are completed. You have hydropower, you have flood control, you have great benefit toward regional development. It's in the greatest tradition of Franklin Roosevelt and the TVA, but it's now some of the funding has been put in jeopardy by the World Bank. So once again, China is taking a central role in this project, but that's where it stands right now. It's not. I think a couple of the dams have already been built, but the whole project involves 7 dams. Next. Now this is very interesting. South Africa was moving forward. Of course, South Africa is one of the most rich nations in the world in terms of uranium. But they had a fledgling industry to start producing what's called the high-temperature modular gas-cooled pebble bed fission reactor, and with some pressure from Obama, among others, that project was shut down. But now it's been brought back to life. And the modular idea is that these reactors are small, but you can plug them together like Tinker Toys, and get the amount of energy that you require. I don't totally understand the technology, but you're exposing uranium, like a graphite ball.
The ceramic.
Ceramic and graphite. Right, at the size of a tennis ball. There's no way to melt down. And it's gas cooled, so you don't see these big old cooling towers like you saw with the old-fashioned light water reactors. And as the fuel is depleted, the voltage kind of drops to the bottom, and you can crush it and recycle it and so forth. But anyway, now this is back in action again with this project forward. South Africa may become a great producer of nuclear power development to fulfill the dream of Nkrumah and others. Next. And this is what I mentioned, the possibility of a corridor to Gibraltar. Next. Also over from Sicily over to Tunisia. That would be interesting. Of course, that means they have to finish the bridge from Italy to Sicily, right? Well, once again, kind of the old process where you call these desperate refugees fleeing Africa, you get a vision. And I guess I'll quote from my friend Hussein Asghari here from his presentation at our event in Frankfurt, that he says, according to the United Nations, by 2050, the bulk of the world's population growth will take place in Africa. Of the additional 2.4 billion people projected to be born between 2015 and 2050, 1.3 billion will be added in Africa. By 2030, Southwest Asia and Africa will have jointly contributed the greatest population growth, 46.9 above 2015 level. Of all world regions, reaching 1.9 billion in 2030 with an amazing median age of only 23 years. Those who think this is a major problem belong to the old paradigm, while those who believe this is a great opportunity belong to the new. So, think about Prince Philip and calling the bird and all that stuff. versus this. You could see the magnet, Africa becoming a magnet for world development. But certainly, if things get much worse in Germany and so forth, the refugees would be going the other way, right? Next. So the question is, where is the U.S. fit in all of this, right? Yesterday, President Trump spoke in Pensacola, Florida, right? And what he was looking to is our positive economic accomplishment. And that last week, the Dow Jones went over 24,000. Yay! The highest high in human history, right? He was taking credit for this, and this is because of the tax cut, supposedly. The cycle. Anyone who believes that is nuts. And out in the field, I had a guy in Sugar Land last week who was cursing at me, because I said, you're nuts if you believe in these financial markets. But, that is what is taught everywhere. That was the essence of Hillary's campaign. She was the Wall Street designated candidate, but the contamination of this kind of monstrous thing is everywhere, as opposed to, go back to Hamilton, but the real source of wealth is the creative power of the human mind. And you consider that China, with 4 billion people, are uplifting these people, with a level of culture that certainly is just breathtaking in terms of Beethoven and violin and all the space program. They are making themselves the richest country in the world, and it's not our fault, and it's not our problem, because this nation is the one that created that historic tradition in our revolution. But once again, on the question of infrastructure, Mr. LaRouche doesn't like to call it infrastructure. He likes it to call it the platform. The interesting thing about the infrastructure you build is not the infrastructure as an end in and of itself. It's a question of where are you going, right? What is this a platform for? Next slide. That's where we're going. There's a big universe out there, okay? And so this is where we're going as a movement. And one thing I didn't mention, that today is the birthday of Keisha Rogers. And I think Keisha may, and we open up for question and answer, but Keisha may want to come up and say a little something. Not right now? Okay, let's turn on the lights, and I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'll rush to the microphone at once.
The Suez Canal, when that was originally built, right, the U.S. built it.
No, it was built by France.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Panama. Okay, and the way we set up is that the U.S. puts capital in it,
the way the Panama Canal was built is that obvious that that canal should have been built and needed to be built. But that little stretch of land was not called Panama then, it was called Colombia. Okay? And after Teddy Roosevelt became president, they wanted to make sure that U.S. interests would control the canal. So they basically organized a revolution to split off that piece of Colombia to a separate country, and then they rushed to a recognition to the U.S. Congress, and then the U.S. did the whole thing. And, they used local labor, and it was pretty awful. You had yellow fever and so forth and so on. And yes, they, I guess.
That's where yellow fever was counted.
Yeah.
Counted.
Well, that's a good thing. And who was the guy? Schweiker? Today, Walter Reed was a key fellow in the conquering of yellow fever. But it was purely a U.S. project.
But the finance was done by the U.S., but then they gave Panama back.
Well, that happened under Jimmy Carter, but there's a good long time between. Right.
But I'm saying that in terms of the funds for Panama, they are controlling the fees and they no,
I don't know.
Yes,
I guess
Panama, the country of Panama owns the Panama Canal.
owns the Panama Canal, but
They just expanded it.
right. And remember, it was only under Jimmy Carter. In other words, 70-some years after the canal was built.
but that wasn't 60.
Yeah, but then under the very next presidency, George Bush, Noriega was overthrown, and the U.S. went in there and killed 2,300 people. And but yeah, under Reagan, but yeah, you had Reagan. Yeah, but now Panama's got a certain degree of sovereignty back, and we did have a representative of the Panamanian consulate speak at our event at Rice University a couple of months ago, and yes, they are totally excited about the new Silk Road. The nation of Panama has just recognized finally mainland China as the legitimate government of China, whereas up until this year it was Taiwan that they had acknowledged. Yes. Okay.
What are the results of the things, if you will? President Trump went to China and he did some sort of negotiations with the president of China. And there was some positive trade results. However, I haven't heard anything in relation to the platinum or infrastructure.
Well, because everything was private. It was, he took with, the question was from Alfred, was what was the outcome of President Trump's trip to China? This was really magnificent. He took with him the CEOs and key leaders of 70 key American corporations, industrial concerns, including Caterpillar and Westinghouse, General Electric, Honeywell, some beef and cattle concerns. Anyway, what was negotiated through private agreement was $250 billion worth of trade and development contracts, including $93 billion that are going to go into the state of West Virginia alone, in terms of coal, natural gas, and $83 billion. It's amazing. There's a little thing you can get on YouTube from Governor Justice of West Virginia. That state has been just written off. Opioid addiction, of course, the coal sector was totally creamed in the recent period. And so a lifeline was thrown, and as I said, you may not know, is that Mayor Turner, Lester Turner, recently back from China with a delegation from here in Houston. And there's going to be a bilateral trade and development thing centered around the airport. We don't know anything more than that. Maybe they'll be holding a press conference.
Which airport?
I call it the International Airport of Houston. Bush Airport.
I thought you were talking about okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So in answer to your question, there was absolutely nothing worked out on the infrastructure question. Then that's what we're saying our challenge has to be. And, President Trump is going to give his State of the Union address in about 50 days. And let's face it, on all the stuff that he promised, he really has delivered very little. And the reason people were willing to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt and vote for him, in swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio, blue-collar states, because they've been given the short end of the stick, by the free trade, the outsourcing, all of us, right? Right. And so when President Trump on the campaign trail was talking about infrastructure and the like, he was, it resonated. But face it, very little has happened. Very little has happened on the question of Harvey relief, right? And so, we have got to bring the U.S. into the Belt and Road officially. Quit fooling around. And as Keisha said, yes, this whole vendetta that's been launched, like somehow claim that Putin was, somehow corrupted the election process. Yes, the enemy of choice is Russia in this one, but not far behind that is a lot of the anti-China stuff that you see out there. Where before President Trump went over there, you had a whole array of articles about Xi Jinping as the new Mao Zedong, the new cult figure, et cetera, et cetera. And it's paradoxical because on the one hand, they've been saying, oh, well, China's investments are so far flung, it's going to all crash, They're building ghost cities and so forth, right? Well, but then they're saying China's taking over the world. Well, how can you have it both ways? How can they be getting ready to crash and they're also taking over the world, right? And it defies their imagination. But the point is, if you're extending credit for productive activity, you're building goodwill, you're creating real wealth of an intangible sort, the creative power of an individual, that doesn't always show up in the ledger book. This is what
25 years later.
Yes, you create. Why would they invest $93 billion into 80, for heaven's sake, right? But they're looking, they're looking at the human content, and this is a Christian idea, it's a Jewish idea, it's an Islamic idea, and it's a Confucian idea. Man is a creative individual. I don't know you. What's your name? Laurie?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Glad you came. Got any questions on things?
What's going on in Ghana? I was in
Very
Ghana,
interesting.
but
Am I still on here? Here's an article that just came out this week. I will read it to you. Thank you for asking that, Lori, because this just came out December the 4th, right? This is in Port Africa. A speech by Ghana's president calling for Africa to end its dependency on the West is a viral hit. This has gone out all over the place. And you had the president of France and a conversation with the president of Ghana, President Francis Macron. I'm just going to read part of this article. The idea that African countries have long been independent, free to pursue their own destiny, seems obvious to young Africans across the continent. Yet the everyday reality often feels far from that. Some 50 to 60 years after independence for many countries, Africa's fortunes seem to still be closely aligned with developmental support and financial aid from former colonial rulers, the United States, the European Union, from multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. After the most recent rounds of African debt forgiveness and rising commodity prices over the last decade, that conversation seems to have shifted somewhat. There are now more calls for investment and trade rather than aid. But anyway, what had happened is that Macron had given this rather condescending speech about, well, we're going to try to be a bit more generous, for partnership in terms of the aid. That's the old paradigm. They throw out a few crumbs in the way of aid to alleviate hunger, and you've got to stick with us politically. And President Nana Akufo-Addo loudly said that Africa must stop relying on Europe for handouts. Says that we can no longer continue to make policies for ourselves in our country, in our region, and in our continent on the basis of whatever support the Western world or France or the Europeans can give us. It will not work, it has not worked, and it will not work, right? So the visibly uncomfortable Macron fidgeted, appearing unsure which side of the room to turn his gaze, as his African counterpart stopped short, saying, while aid is appreciated, he wouldn't be propositioning us. We have to get away from this mindset of dependency, this mindset of what can France do for us? France will do whatever it wants to do for its own sake. When those coincide with ours, tant mieux, so much the better, as the French say. Our concern should be, what do we need to do in the 21st century to move Africa away from being cap in hand, begging for aid, for charity, for handouts? The African continent we look at its resources, to be giving monies to other places. We need to have a mindset that says we can do it, and once we have that mindset, we'll see there's a liberating factor for ourselves. So, I don't know if that addresses what you're saying, Lori, but with a little bit of internal development, you know, right, they can reach a threshold of development where they won't have to depend on China. I mean, China's extending these long-term loans to get the process rolling, but
Now, the only problem with that, what about this CIA or this Africa? Will they be undermining whatever they do, or you don't know?
of course they will.
I know.
Were you here when I talked about the African thing? Yes, of course. But once again, that goes back to what we're doing around Robert Mueller. You know, see, Robert Mueller, and I did a class on this about a month ago. You know, the CIA, the FBI, all these agencies conceived and brought into existence as basically enforcing the empire policy in the United States. And it's ugly. But see, there's more and more developments every day on the Mueller stuff, which we get, where these Republicans are now beginning to get a more fleshed out picture of things. Like the latest thing is that we now know that this guy Christopher Steele wrote the sex dossier on Trump and so forth, that he was meeting in 2016 with key operatives of our own Justice Department, and we'll probably find that they were meeting with elements of the Hillary campaign, But you see, Republicans tend to stay on that level of, this proves it's the Democratic Party plot, right? No, they don't care about party. They just want to keep the process where there's no institution anywhere that can break the grip of what America's become. America's wishes to be loved and admired all around the world has become more and more resented and hated because we've become an extension of that empire policy. And that had a cultural component, but it certainly had an intelligence component as well. It's to know about Ed Snowden, and what he was exposing, the Five Eyes thing, that all the intelligence was shared between the British and the U.S. as their dearest friends and allies. Bull. They've been stabbing us in the back from the get-go. So if we blow the Mueller thing, a lot of other stuff will get ripped out as well, and it can all be good, no matter what year we get. It's not Trump's job to indict people. Well, this week, members of Congress, I guess it was Grassley, Senator Grassley, filed some contempt charges. Was it Devin Nunes? Right, because they've been subpoenaing all these documents and so forth, and the FBI has been stonewalling. But it's a paradoxical situation, because we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and then we've got the judicial branch, which is the courts. So Congress and the legislative branch are supposed to make the laws, the executive branch is supposed to enforce them, right? The executive branch is the Department of Justice, but Sessions recused himself early on. Of course, Trump came out and himself fired Mueller. I said if Trump came out and fired Mueller. Well, you remember how it happened under Nixon, when Nixon fired Archibald Cox and so forth and so on, they cover up collusion and so forth. And in that context, that ended up being a factor in the Watergate thing. So I can't see Trump's mind. I'm just saying that we have to do the most ruthless job that we can do, and not just go to the conservatives about this. We're going to go to the Bernie Sanders types, that are to the abuses of the Department of Justice and others, because it's everywhere, and our movement is doing that. We had an event in the Upper West Side of Manhattan 2 weeks ago, where we helped bring this event together with William Binney and Ray McGovern, who are former intelligence operatives of the NSA and the CIA who risked their careers to challenge this, right? And so you had these kind of progressive liberals, in the room, but then all their fuses were being blown because these guys were developing how the Hillary thing worked and so forth. So we do have to break down that partisan divide, which is part of the geopolitical mindset. We need some independent people in Congress. Don't people agree?
Yeah.
Yay! Yes, that's true. When you bring up Panama, remember the invasion of Panama? It happened at Christmas time. It's Christmas, let's go invade a country, right? That was Bush Sr. And Noriega, who had been given gold medals by the DEA for being an ally, really fighting the drugs flowing through Central America, he was overthrown based on somehow that he was pro-drug. That was the brainwashing. Well, who was? Yeah, that's right. They found some tamale powder in his apartment and said it was cocaine. But who was running the drugs? Of course, it was George Bush that was running the drugs, right? With Oliver North, tons of drugs. And this was the crack epidemic in the 1980s, where they were flooding the black community, African American community, with this adulterated cocaine, and it would drive people crazy. And so Bush launches war on drugs, which was just rounding up mostly black men, throwing them in prison. They'd ruin their lives. They'd get criminal records. But on the higher level, he was, of course, involved in bringing it in. In order to justify that invasion of Panama, Mueller was the prosecutor that was going into the prisons of Colombia and Mexico and getting the incarcerated members of the cartels and say, well, we'll reduce your sentence if you say something bad about Noriega, right? So they reduced their sentence from 200 years to 10 years or something, or with fines and penalties. That was Noriega. He doesn't give a damn about truth. I mean, that was Mueller. He doesn't care about justice, truth, or anything. He's just out to just carry it, as we say, he's an amoral political assassin.
And the point about Noriega was because he wasn't going along with Bush.
Yeah, that was part of it. I think there was also a degree of revenge because they probably didn't agree with what Carter had done around the Panama Canal. But yeah, he was on to the Bush drug game, and he was working with LaRouche. We were in touch with Noriega until he died. We sent his cars back and forth on prison.
You have to go to St. 75th birthday.
Yeah,
Noriega wrote a greeting
from
to Lyndon and LaRouche, dear friend.
Yeah.
So you were saying, you were sentence about the House Intelligence Committee handed out 2 indictments
to the FBI, I think, right? Right. Okay. We got Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, and Rob Ray. These are OJ that they've been ordered by Congress to hand over relevant documents.
I want to see that.
Well, let's see. Louise?
Trump adding around saying he would like proof.
Right. Well, I addressed that in part of my presentation today. It's in and of itself, it's a very provocative action. In the minds of much of the Muslim world, the question of Jerusalem is like the Chinese look at Taiwan. I mean, we crossed that line, right? Trump's statement was not, if you look at it, wasn't utterly inflammatory. In fact, there was a law passed here in the 1990s that when Bill Clinton was president, Congress put through something to the effect that Jerusalem is the legitimate capital of Israel. And, president's successfully been kicking it down the road 6 months at a time. But, Trump may have been, you have this Christian fundamentalist element thing, which is not good at all. But if you have a peaceful development perspective, as I said, for the entire region, there's a way that both Palestine and Israel could both establish, Jerusalem as their capital, but you've got to bring together the region together through something like what we call the Oasis Plan for regional development. Otherwise, I don't know, with a day of rage with demonstrations, against Trump and the USA, and so in of itself could not be so good.
I was just going to say, what you laid out in terms of the next days, Trump's got to move on a consolidated program to get the entire development going on internationally. So this very network that you're describing is pretty strategic political. So not that any of these particular things aren't real and real fight, but these are the kinds of things that, break up a movement so if we keep our eye on the bigger fight against the empire, have to work out these particulars, we have to be more careful. Don't get pulled into a single fight and lose the bigger battle. It's about not keeping ourselves there.
Unfortunately, Palestine has come to depend on a lot for its survival on support from the Saudis, So it would be in their interest to try to inflame this thing as much as they could. So, but Ron's right. We always have to be light on our feet and keep our eye on the real enemy that we're fighting, and not get sucked into the kind of dead-end stuff that the oligarchy's always going up. But they are running out of tricks. Like this thing around Iran. When Tillerson's been trying to recruit Iraq into an alliance against Iran. Iran's not dumb. They got sucked into that one during the Reagan period. So I think we're about done, Mike. Thank you very much for coming, guys. Thank you very much.